They found me in the vestry, still wearing the veil. My father would not look at me. The seamstress who had sewn seed pearls into the lace for 3 months stood in the doorway, her hands twisted in her apron. No one knew what to say to a woman who had been left like a letter, unopened, returned to sender. The church bells had been silenced. The flowers were already wilting in their vases. It was the spring of 1878, and I was 23 years old. My name was Constance Hartwell, though by then I felt I had no name at all. In the space between walking up the aisle and realising he would not be waiting, I had become something society had no word for. Not a bride, not quite a spinster, simply a woman who had been seen, publicly, to be unwanted. The morning had been perfect. April rain on the windows of my father's house, the kind that makes everything smell of earth and possibility. I had watched my reflection in the mirror as my mother fastened the buttons at my wrists, each one a tiny pearl. She had smiled then, believing, as I did, that my future was a door about to open. How strange that doors can close just as easily and just as quietly. Thomas Ashford had courted me for 2 years. He was the second son of a manufacturing family, ambitious and charming in that particular way, of men who know their smile is a form of currency. He had brought me books of poetry, walked with me through the garden behind our house, spoken of the life we would build together. He had kissed me once, in the shadow of the rose arbour, and I had felt the world tilt on its axis. I believed him. That is the part that burns most cleanly when I remember it now. I believed every word. The note arrived 3 hours before the ceremony. My father received it in his study, and when he came to tell me, his face had aged a decade. Thomas had written that he could not proceed, that circumstances had changed, that he hoped I would understand. He did not explain. He did not apologise. He simply withdrew, as if our engagement had been a business arrangement that no longer served his interests. Later, I learned the truth. Thomas had been conducting a second courtship, one far more profitable than ours. While he walked with me through our modest garden, he had been visiting the estate of Lucinda Pemberton, whose father owned half the coal mines in Yorkshire. While he read me poetry, he had been calculating his future in increments of wealth and social position. While he kissed me in the rose arbour, he had already decided I was not enough. They married 6 weeks after he left me, standing in that church. I heard about it from the housekeeper, who heard it from the butcher's wife, who had seen the announcement in the London papers. Mrs. Lucinda Ashford. The name felt like a mockery, like something that should have been mine but had been given to someone else because she could pay a higher price. I did not leave the house for 3 months. Not from shame, though there was that. Not from grief, though grief lived in my chest like a stone I could not swallow. I stayed inside because I was changing, and the change required darkness and silence to complete itself. I was learning what I was made of beneath the layers of expectation and obedience. I was discovering that humiliation, when it does not destroy you, can clarify your vision in remarkable ways. My mother worried. She brought me tea on painted trays and sat by my bed, stroking my hair as if I were a child again. She spoke of time healing all wounds, of other opportunities, of how I was still young and lovely. I let her speak. I drank the tea. But I was not waiting to heal. I was waiting to understand. The understanding came slowly, like light returning after a long eclipse. I realised that Thomas had not simply rejected me. He had used me. Our engagement had been a safety net while he pursued something better, a way to maintain respectability while he calculated his options. I had been a placeholder, a practice version of the life he actually wanted, and when he no longer needed the illusion, he had discarded it without a second thought. This knowledge did not make me weep. It made me watchful. I began to read the society pages with new attention. I learned where the Ashfords lived, what parties they attended, which charitable organisations Lucinda patronised. I discovered that they had taken a house in Belgravia, that Thomas had been given a position in his father-in-law's company, that Lucinda was considered a beauty and a gracious hostess. Their life appeared, from a distance, to be a portrait of success and happiness. But I had learned to look more carefully at surfaces, and I began to notice small inconsistencies in the narrative of their perfect marriage. Lucinda appeared at certain events alone. Thomas was often described as being away on business. There were gaps in their social calendar that suggested something other than contentment. I waited. Patience, I discovered, is a form of power that women are taught to practice but rarely encouraged to weaponize. I waited and watched and collected information the way other women collected calling cards and dance programs. I became a student of their lives, not out of obsession, but out of strategy. My education in observation took place in drawing rooms and at charity bazaars, in the lobbies of theatres and the corners of ballrooms where women like me learned to become invisible. I perfected the art of the sympathetic listener, the woman who asks interested questions and receives confidences in return. I learned who Lucinda's closest friends were, which dressmaker she favoured, what books she borrowed from the lending library. I discovered, through a chance conversation with a housemaid who worked 2 doors down from the Ashfords' Belgravia address, that the household was not as harmonious as it appeared. Lucinda often wept in her sitting room. Thomas came home late, smelling of perfume that was not his, wife's. There were arguments conducted in urgent whispers, the kind that stop abruptly when servants enter rooms. This information did not bring me joy. Rather, it brought something closer to recognition. Lucinda was learning what I had learned, though she had paid a higher price for the lesson. She had not been left at an altar. She had been taken to one, and the betrayal had come later, after she could not easily escape it. I began to understand that my revenge would not be against Thomas alone. It would be, in a strange way, for Lucinda. For the woman who had unknowingly taken my place and discovered it was not a place worth having. The seasons turned. Summer burned into autumn. I watched the leaves fall in the garden and thought about transformation, about how things must die before they can become something new. I was changing, cell by cell, thought by thought. The woman who had believed Thomas's promises was gone. In her place was someone harder, clearer, more purposeful. I began to attend more events, carefully choosing gatherings where I might encounter Thomas without making my presence obvious. I wanted him to see me, but at a distance. I wanted him to understand that I had not vanished into obscurity, that I had not been destroyed by what he had done. I dressed well, spoke intelligently, moved through society with a new kind of confidence. I was no longer waiting to be chosen. I was choosing how to be seen. Once, at a charity auction for orphans, I caught his eye across the room. He had been laughing at something another man said, playing the role of successful husband and businessman. Our eyes met, and his laughter stopped mid-breath. I saw the flash of guilt, quickly covered. I smiled, a small, enigmatic smile, and turned away. Let him wonder what I was thinking. Let him imagine what I might know. The information I gathered was not dramatic. There were no love letters discovered, no flagrant scandals uncovered. What I learned was quieter and more damning. Thomas was exactly who he had always been, a man who valued appearance over substance, who measured worth in pounds and social position, who believed that charm could substitute for character. He had married Lucinda for her father's money and connections. He had married her for the house in Belgravia and the position in the company. He had married her because she was beautiful and accomplished and would look perfect on his arm at important dinners. He had not married her for love, any more than he would have married me for love. This understanding crystallized in my mind like ice forming on a window, clear, sharp, undeniable. Thomas had not rejected me specifically. He had simply followed his nature, which was to pursue advantage and discard anything that did not serve it. I had been fortunate, in the end, to escape him. Lucinda had not been so lucky. I wrote to her once. Not directly, but through a friend of a friend, a woman who knew Lucinda from their shared work at a hospital charity. I sent a note, unsigned, expressing admiration for her charitable efforts and suggesting that women who support each other can accomplish remarkable things. It was a seed, nothing more. A small gesture that said, "You are not alone, even if you feel alone." I do not know if she ever received it. I do not know if it meant anything to her. But I sent it because I had learned something about revenge that I had not understood at the beginning. True revenge is not about diminishing your enemy. It is about refusing to let your enemy diminish you. It is about building networks of understanding and support among the people your enemy has tried to isolate or use. It is about becoming someone your enemy never expected you to be. 1 year after he left me at the altar, I received news that stopped time. Lucinda Ashford had died. Pneumonia, they said, though there were whispers of other complications. She had been ill for some weeks. The funeral would be held at St. Mark's, the same church where Thomas and I were to have been married. The same church where I had stood in the vestry with my veil still on, understanding for the first time that the world was not what I had believed it to be. I knew immediately that I would attend, not to gloat, not to cause a scene, but because something in me recognised this as the moment I had been waiting for, without knowing I was waiting. The door had closed when Thomas walked away from our wedding. Now another door was opening, and I would walk through it with my eyes wide open. I spent the evening before the funeral composing myself. Not my appearance, though I attended to that with care. I wore black silk, mourning dress that was appropriate and elegant, a veil that covered my face but did not hide it entirely. I looked like any other woman paying her respects to the dead. But what I was composing was something deeper. I was assembling the person I had become in the year since Thomas left me, the woman who understood that revenge is not about inflicting pain. It is about reclaiming dignity and revealing truth. The morning of the funeral was grey and cold, the kind of November day that feels like the year is dying. I arrived at St. Mark's early, before the crowds gathered, and stood for a moment in the churchyard. The last time I had been here, I was wearing white and carrying orange blossoms. Now I wore black and carried nothing but my own resolve. Inside, the church smelled of lilies and beeswax. The coffin rested near the altar, draped in white lilies and surrounded by candles. It was beautiful and terrible. This final presentation of a woman I had never met, but whose life had been built on the ruins of my own. I took a seat near the back, where I could observe without being obvious. The church filled slowly with mourners, most of them people I recognised from the society pages. Thomas's family, Lucinda's family, friends and business associates, a congregation of respectability, all gathered to witness the proper ending of a proper life. The pews creaked softly as people settled into them. The sound of fabric rustling, of prayer books being opened and closed, of whispered condolences exchanged. The air was thick with the scent of lilies, that funeral flower that smells of both sweetness and decay. Candles flickered in their brass holders, casting shadows that moved like ghosts across the stone walls. I watched the mourners with a detachment I had not known I possessed. There was Lucinda's father, his face carved into an expression of grief that looked like anger. There were her sisters, young women in their mourning dress, their faces pale beneath their veils. There were Thomas's parents, his mother dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief edged in black. And then Thomas entered. He walked down the aisle behind the pallbearers, his face carefully arranged in an expression of grief. He wore a black suit and a black armband, and he looked older than I remembered, as if the year had not been kind to him either. There were lines around his eyes that had not been there before, a tightness to his jaw that spoke of stress or guilt or simply the weight of maintaining appearances. He did not see me. He was too focused on his performance, on presenting himself as the devastated widower. But I saw him. I saw everything. The way his grief seemed rehearsed, as if he had practiced it in a mirror. The way his eyes darted to the crowd, assessing their reactions. The way he held himself with the particular tension of a man who is playing a role and knows he must play it perfectly. He took his seat in the front pew, and for a moment his head bowed. Was he praying? Was he thinking of Lucinda, of the woman he had married for all the wrong reasons? Or was he thinking of himself, of his reputation, of how this death might affect his standing in society? I would never know, and I realised, sitting there in that church, that I no longer cared what Thomas thought or felt. He had become irrelevant to my internal landscape. What mattered was what I thought and felt, and what I chose to do with that understanding. The service began. A vicar spoke of Lucinda's kindness and beauty, of her devotion to charitable works, of the tragedy of a life cut short. He spoke of Thomas's loss, of how difficult it was to lose a beloved wife. He spoke of God's mysterious ways and the comfort of faith. I listened and I waited, because I knew something no one else in that church knew, something I had learned through my careful watching, through conversations with a housemaid I had befriended, through letters I had intercepted and questions I had asked in places where women like me are often invisible. Lucinda had not died of pneumonia. She had died of a broken heart, if such a thing can be measured in medical terms. She had died after months of watching her husband conduct an affair with a widow in Mayfair. She had died after realising that Thomas had married her for her money and had never intended to be faithful. She had died after discovering, too late, that the man she thought she loved had only ever loved himself. She had died the way I had nearly died, of a wound that society does not acknowledge because it leaves no visible scar. When the service ended, there was a receiving line in the vestibule. Thomas stood with Lucinda's father, accepting condolences, shaking hands, embodying the grief-stricken husband. I joined the line. I waited my turn, and when I stood before him, I lifted my veil. The recognition in his eyes was immediate and terrible. His face went pale. His hand, which had been extended to shake mine, froze in mid-air. "Constance," he said, and my name in his mouth sounded like something fragile breaking. Mr. Ashford, I replied. My voice was steady. My gaze was direct. I came to pay my respects. He stared at me, and I watched him understand. I watched him realise that I knew, that I had always known, that my presence here was not coincidence but judgment. He began, but I raised my hand gently, stopping him. There is nothing to say, I told him. Your wife deserved better. I hope you remember that. I did not wait for his response. I turned and walked away, through the vestibule, down the stone steps, out into the grey November air. Behind me, I heard a murmur ripple through the crowd. Someone had recognised me. Someone had understood why my presence was significant. The whispers would begin now, the questions, the speculation. By evening, the story would be all over London. The woman Thomas Ashford left at the altar had attended his wife's funeral. She had been gracious and dignified. She had said nothing cruel, but her presence had spoken volumes. It had reminded everyone of what he had done and how easily he might do it again. It had cast a shadow over his grief, made it impossible to see him as purely a victim of circumstance. I had not destroyed him. I had simply shown him for what he was. I walked through the streets of London, and for the first time in a year, I felt the weight lift from my chest. I had not sought cruelty. I had sought truth. And truth, delivered with precision and dignity, is the most powerful form of revenge. The weeks that followed brought changes I had not anticipated. Invitations began to arrive at my father's house, from women I barely knew. They wanted to call on me, to take tea, to hear my perspective on matters of the heart. I had become, without intending to, a symbol of something. A woman who had been wronged but had not been broken. A woman who had reclaimed her dignity not through scandal or rage, but through the quiet assertion of her own worth. I accepted some of the invitations. I learned that I was not alone in my experience. Many of these women had their own stories of betrayal, of men who had used them or dismissed them. We spoke carefully, in drawing rooms over china cups, but beneath the careful language was a recognition. We were survivors of a system that valued us primarily for what we could bring to a transaction, and we were learning, slowly, to value ourselves for something else entirely. Thomas's reputation suffered, though not catastrophically. He was still received in society, still employed by his father-in-law's company. But there was a tarnish now that could not be polished away. Women regarded him with suspicion. Men treated him with a new wariness. He had been exposed not as a villain, but as something perhaps worse. A man of weak character who would abandon anyone who no longer served his ambitions. I heard, through the network of whispers that connects all women in society, that he had tried to call on me, that he had sent a letter which my father refused to deliver, that he wanted to explain, to apologise, to somehow undo what had been done. I felt nothing when I heard this. Not satisfaction, not pity. He had become irrelevant to me, a figure from a past I had already moved beyond. Spring came again. 1 year since the morning I had stood in my wedding dress, waiting for a future that never arrived. I walked through the garden behind my father's house, and the roses were blooming. The same arbour where Thomas had kissed me stood in the corner, covered now in new growth. I stood there for a moment, remembering the girl I had been. She seemed impossibly young to me now, impossibly trusting. But I did not regret her. She had loved honestly and hoped genuinely, and there is no shame in that. The shame belonged to the man who had exploited those qualities, who had mistaken vulnerability for weakness. I had learned that revenge is not about destruction. It is about balance. It is about standing in the place where you were meant to be erased and saying, quietly but firmly, I am still here. You did not unmake me. You only revealed yourself. That summer, I took a position as a companion to an elderly widow who travelled extensively. We went to Paris, to Rome, to cities where no one knew my story or cared about the scandal of an abandoned engagement. I learned to speak Italian, to appreciate art, to move through the world as someone defined by curiosity and intelligence rather than by what had been done to me. I learned that there are many ways to build a life, and marriage to a man like Thomas Ashford was only one of them, and perhaps the least interesting. Years passed. I heard occasionally about Thomas. He remarried eventually, another wealthy woman, though this time with less fanfare. He continued his climb through society, though he never quite reached the heights he had imagined for himself. There was always that shadow, that whisper, that reminder. I built a different kind of life. I wrote articles for ladies' magazines under a pseudonym, essays about women's education and social reform. I became involved in charitable work, not the fashionable kind that wealthy women did for appearance's sake, but the kind that actually changed lives. I never married, which society found scandalous, but I also never regretted it. Because I had learned something that day in the church, standing before Thomas with my veil lifted. I had learned that the most powerful thing a woman can do is refuse to disappear. Refuse to accept the narrative that she is worthless because a man has declared her so. Refuse to let humiliation become identity. I am an old woman now. My hair is white. My hands, which once trembled as they held a bouquet of orange blossoms, are steady and lined with age. I live in a small house with a large library, and I am content in a way that would have seemed impossible to the girl who stood weeping in that vestry so many years ago. Sometimes I think about that April morning, about the rain on the windows and the seed pearls sewn into my veil. I think about how certain I was that my life depended on Thomas Ashford's presence in it, how convinced I was that without him I would be nothing. How strange, how miraculous to have been so completely wrong. Without him, I became everything I was meant to be. The door he closed was not an ending. It was an invitation to find another way forward, one that I walked through with my eyes open and my dignity intact. I never saw him again after that funeral. I never needed to. The moment I lifted my veil and looked him in the eye, I took back everything he had tried to take from me. Not through cruelty, not through scandal, but through the simple act of existing, visibly and undeniably, in a space where he had tried to erase me. That is the revenge I took, and it was more complete than any vengeance I might have imagined in those dark months after he left me. I did not destroy him. I built myself, and that was more powerful than destruction could ever be. The rain falls now as it did then, April rain on old windows. And I sit by the fire with a book in my lap, a woman who was left at the altar and who learned, in the years that followed, that being left can be the beginning of finding yourself. That betrayal can teach you what loyalty actually means. That the worst thing that ever happened to you can also be the thing that sets you free. I was Constance Hartwell, the woman who was left. But I became someone else entirely, someone he could never have imagined and never had the power to prevent. And that, in the end, was the only revenge that ever mattered.